Good evening. Welcome to the last keynote lecture of the 2015 Race, Ethnicity, and Identity Conference. Tonight, we're privileged to have Dr. Ann Bonds, Assistant Professor of Geography and Urban Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Ann has conducted quite a bit of research devoted to matters associated with social justice and has actually conducted quite a bit of research as well in matters associated with feminism and feminist geography. She has worked with esteemed geographers both at the University of Arizona and the University of Washington, where she received her PhD. And tonight, she's going to be discussing this matter associated with race, gender, colorblindness, and geographies of incarceration. So please extend a warm welcome to Ann Bonds.
Thank you very much, Mike. Good evening, everybody. I want to begin this evening by extending my deep gratitude to GRCC Department of Social Sciences and to Mike DeVivo in particular for hosting me. I've had a really wonderful visit. And I want to also thank you all for coming. I know it's the last night of the conference. It's a Thursday evening, and I appreciate your presence here. As you can see, my title is Locating Race and Gender, Colorblindness, and Geographies of Incarceration. And so I've modified the title of my talk slightly. And that's because when I first gave my title to Mike, I kept it kind of wide open because I wasn't sure specifically what I wanted to talk about. But I want to begin today by briefly talking about some of the themes and topics that I explore in my research. And in doing this, I want to both situate my talk, but I also know that many of you here tonight are students, some of you students in social sciences, and some of you maybe even in geography. And I want to give you a sense of the kind of work taking place in the field of geography. As Mike just mentioned a moment ago, I'm a feminist, urban, and economic geographer, and I have expertise in race, gender, poverty, and community and neighborhood development. So really, an overall goal of my research is to explore how racial and gender identities are produced, transformed, and sustained through unequal economic geographies. And so you'll see that thread running through my research. Much of my research has focused on prisons and incarceration. And you know, at first glance, this may not actually seem to be a topic that's directly connected to geography. But in fact, prisons are inherently geographic phenomena. They're formulated on the basis of spatially separating and confining groups of people. And prisons are not evenly distributed across the landscape. Have you ever wondered, for example, how it is that a prison came to be located in a particular area? There's a very specific spatial patterning and racial geography to prisons. And prisons tend to be located in predominantly rural, white communities. And they are filled, of course, with people from low-income communities of color in cities. And so I became very interested in this dynamic, and I wanted to explore more about how prisons had become economic development strategies for communities that were struggling with poverty. And I was really interested in knowing more about the kinds of racial identities and logics that supported this particular kind of economic development. You know, how is it that prisons have become so taken for granted in our society? I currently have a research project together with colleagues in public health, history, and film that examines the neighborhood implications and community health impacts of mass incarceration in Milwaukee. And so, you know, one of the questions that we're interested in exploring is, you know, what happens when huge swaths of people from neighborhoods of color are swept into remote prisons? How does this process transform places and shape communities over time and even generations? I also have a current project that explores women's reentry following incarceration. And of course, this is what I'm going to be focusing more on today. Finally, you know, another final area of my research is looking more at colorblind community development strategies. And so what I mean by this are, you know, development plans, development strategies that don't explicitly engage with ideas of race, that aren't articulated through ideas of race, but that have very clear racial implications. And so I'll be talking momentarily about this concept of colorblindness. So I'd like to move now kind of into more of the body of my talk. And I want to start this evening by noting that we live in a strange and vexing period of racial contradiction. On the surface, race and racism appear to be vanishing. Today, it's socially and politically untenable to openly identify as racist or to speak in support of racism. Although, of course, over the past few weeks, we've seen some interesting instances where this has emerged. But nonetheless, most Americans claim not to see race. And the common refrain for this kind of thinking is seeing people, not race. On the other hand, even as this way of thinking about race, and this is often referred to by scholars of race as racial colorblindness, so even as this kind of thinking about race has really taken hold in the United States, we've seen a sharpening of racial differences. And the fact of the matter remains that we remain a starkly racially segregated nation. So for example, I don't know if anybody can read that, I apologize in the back, but people of color currently earn about 40% less than whites and have about 1/8 of the net worth or wealth of white households. And the racial wealth gap has expanded rather than narrowed following the Great Recession. A recent study by the Economic Policy Institute finds that black children in America are more economically and socially isolated today than in any other time. 60 years after the passage of Brown versus the Board of Education, we are witnessing what educational scholar Jonathan Kozol calls the resegregation of America. Blacks and Latinos are racially profiled and grossly overrepresented in the criminal justice system. And according to a 2012 report from the Malcolm X Grassroots Foundation, Black Americans are killed by police or extra-legal security forces every 36 hours in the United States. So even as our national racial imaginary hinges on not seeing race, and even though most Americans view racism as an anachronistic or passé way of thinking, striking racial inequalities and racial divisions characterize the contemporary landscape. So this leads us back to our contradiction. Race is simultaneously strangely absent, but always present within our national racial discourse. Racial inequality unquestionably contours everyday lives. It influences access to resources or lack thereof. It shapes experiences with an array of social institutions. And when I talk about these, I'm referring to things like schools, prisons, colleges, labor markets. Yet dominant national discourses of race diminish or even suppress discussions of this social reality. Simply invoking race as a means to understand violence and contemporary inequalities is often referred to as playing the race card or race baiting by pundits or politicians. Of course, these sentiments frequently reflect the racial identities of those expressing them. It's far easier for white Americans to say that race no longer matters than it is for people of color who confront, negotiate, and endure this reality on an everyday basis. So no one sees themselves as racist, no one identifies with racist ideology, yet at the same time, racial inequality and racism clearly still exists. So how do we understand this racial context? In the remainder of my talk today, I'd like to explore this racial contradiction through an exploration of the ideology of colorblindness. And I want to, this is a very brief overview, so I'm welcome talking about it more in questions. But following that, I want to talk a little bit more about incarceration, situating incarceration within this dynamic. And then I'll briefly get to talk a little bit about my research on race, gender, and incarceration in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So my analysis here is explicitly intersectional. And what I mean by intersectional is that I consider race as fundamentally connected, inseparable from other kinds of social identities. So ethnicity, obviously, gender, sexuality, and class. Rather than adopting a racial blind or colorblind frame, in this talk I ask, what do we see when we centralize both race and gender in our analyses of incarceration? So from here now, I'd like to move into my discussion of racial colorblindness. What does it mean? What are its implications? To begin with, we have to start with a recognition that conceptions about race and racism are highly malleable and adaptable. And what I mean by this is that they have shifted significantly over time and space. I don't get to talk about this in great detail, but we can look historically and see that constructions of race in the United States have varied considerably throughout history and geography. So ideas about race are socially and spatially constructed. They're human creations. And as social and economic conditions change, so do conceptions of race and racism. Now, I want to be clear here. When I say this, I'm not suggesting that race is not real. Conceptions of race have very real impacts and real effects. We need not look very far to see these effects. But it is important to think about how racial ideologies shift over time. Ideas about race are so pervasive that we take them for granted. We come to think of them as just the way things are. Race scholar Beverly Tatum has argued that stereotypes about race and racist assumptions are like smog in the air. I think this is a really useful metaphor. Sometimes the smog is visible and we can see it. It's really clear. We can think of, for example, the event over the past week with the individuals and the fraternity in Oklahoma. Very clear. But sometimes we can't see those particulates in the air. We don't see the racism. Nonetheless, it's part of our social system, and we're breathing in that air on a daily basis. Contemporary scholars of race, and I'm drawing explicitly from a range of social scientists and individuals in the humanities, Jody Melamed, Dana Ian Davis, Eduardo Bonilla Silva, and David Theo Goldberg. So they argue that in the United States, we've entered into a new racial era. And this is a racial era that is defined by the ideology of colorblindness. Colorblind racial thinking, as I discussed just a few minutes ago at the outset of this talk, is undergirded by what we might call anti-racialism or a deracialism. So what I mean by this is a belief in particular that race is simply no longer a relevant social field, that it no longer operates as a key ideological construct that hierarchically organizes and values or devalues particularly racialized bodies. Now, this frame of thinking actively suppresses race as a legitimate topic for concern or for discussion or for public policy. So this racial period is associated with the post-civil rights, post-Jim Crow era and the end of formally, legally sanctioned racism. This is a period that we often refer to as de jure racism. So what I mean by this is this was a period of time where explicit racial prejudice was codified and enshrined in the law and into our legal system. So we can think of examples of legally protected housing segregation, legally protected school segregation, the segregation of public facilities and accommodations. So colorblind racial thinking is premised on the logic that following civil rights victories, so for example, Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, or the Civil Rights Act of 1968, following these victories then, according to colorblind racial ideology, systemic racism no longer exists. The structural relevance of race and racism have been dissolved or rendered obsolete. And colorblind racial ideology has become so dominant that we, especially for many who have grown up in the age of the post-civil rights era, who have seen the election of the nation's first black president, many see racism as a relic of the past or something that's associated with a small number of individuals or extremist groups. So for example, we might think of the KKK here. Racism is viewed as overt racial hostility or aggression, and it's seen as an anomaly or an aberration from normative racial thinking. It is committed by individuals who are outliers, what you might call bad apples, for example, rather than being viewed as something that is structural, historically and geographically produced, structurally embedded and systematized within a range of institutions. And I'd be happy to talk more about this in the Q&A if you have questions. David Theo Goldberg's analysis of colorblind racial thinking is really useful here, and it's something that I'll draw on as I move forward with the talk. And he argues that in the era of colorblindness, anti-racism has been replaced by anti-racialism. Let me define what this means here. Anti-racism is what we might see as a commitment to working against and challenging racism. And according to Goldberg, this requires historical memory, recalling of conditions of social degradation in order to understand how racism manifests in the contemporary context. By contrast, anti-racialism is what we might see as the opposite. It's a suppression or a denial of race. It requires, according to Goldberg, a getting over, a forgetting, a moving on, a wiping away of the terms of reference or the historical structures that might inform the present. So colorblind racial ideology from a geographic perspective entails what we would call a scalar shift. What I mean by this is that rather than focusing on broader or larger institutions and structures, thinking at large scale here, the way that colorblindness tends to be framed within this particular racial ideology as relating to particular individuals. So racial inequality is understood as emanating from individual behaviors, from individual choices, or from market dynamics. And racially differentiated outcomes are often explained in deracialized terms, often coded language, for example, culture or work ethic. And this way of talking about race don't bring into account histories of racial oppression or even overt discrimination, and the way that past relationships continue to have a bearing on the present. So this anti-racial worldview naturalizes racial hierarchies. And really what's quite important for this kind of thinking is that it constrains the possibility of meaningful public debate about the ongoing significance of race and racism. Okay, so with this, this is a quick overview, I know, but with this kind of broad overview of colorblindness in mind, I'd like to now move on to a conversation about incarceration, so situating it within this racial context. There is no disputing the unprecedented escalation and criminalization of incarceration that has occurred in the US over the past 40 years. As a geographer, this is a representation of this growth that I find particularly useful. So I'm going to throw a whole bunch of statistics at you right now just to kind of characterize this expansion. The United States has the largest prison population in the world, and it's comprised primarily of low-income people of color. This system has grown fivefold since 1970, and it contains over 2.2 million people. Today, over 7.3 million people, so this is 1 in every 31 adults, are on probation, or in jail and prison, or on parole. So 13 million people are currently serving time for a felony conviction or have been convicted of a felony in the past. This statistic gets me every time. Over 47 million people, which equates 25% of the adult population, have state or federal criminal records. Just let that sit for a second. That is a lot. There's also no disputing the racialized and classed configurations of incarceration. And I have to apologize once again. This is really small. I'm not sure if any of you in the back can read it. Also, the statistics that I'm drawing from in my script here are from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and they vary a little bit from the slide image. 1 in every 8 black men between the ages of 24 and 35 is incarcerated. In certain cities, like Milwaukee, where I'm from, or Baltimore or Chicago, this number is much higher. It's actually 1 in 4. 1 in 3 black men and 1 in every 10 Latinos between the ages of 20 and 29 is under some sort of correctional supervision. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the vast majority of those who have experienced incarceration were unemployed, underemployed, or employed in low-wage service work at the time that they committed their offense. So we get a sense that there's a clear race-class dimension we're working with here. Now, these statistics are shocking. I've read, I've written, I've presented them over and over again, and I still find them no less devastating. And while many are quite familiar with the large size of the US criminal justice system, many people are less familiar with the fact that during this period of rapid growth and incarceration, this is a period of time where we've actually seen an overall decline in crime rates. So as is well documented, much of the growth associated with this period of time is related to what is often called law and order politics. and the rise of tough-on-crime policies and laws associated with the war on drugs. So these policies have attached mandatory minimum sentencing requirements to a whole host of nonviolent drug crimes and other offenses, which have essentially had the effect of sending more people to prison and keeping them there for longer. So I use the term mass incarceration to characterize this system, and you've probably heard this terminology before, but also to refer to the vast network of institutionalized practices, policies, laws, and assumptions that undergird and sustain the contemporary landscape of carcerality and social control. We can think about all sorts of ways in which our ideas about this system are reinforced on a regular basis. You can turn on the TV any night and find any number of crime shows, and as most people know, the way that things look in reality are quite different than the way that they occur on the shows. So this broad and often taken for granted nexus of policies and institutions and discourses includes, for example, the tough-on-crime laws I just mentioned, the expansion and expanding criminalization of behaviors that in the past were not criminalized. Those of you who may have been at Matt Taibbi's talk last night may have heard him refer to some of these things. We're talking about loitering, so being in front of a building, sit and lie ordinances, if you're sitting on a sidewalk at certain times in certain areas, these are behaviors that can now be criminalized. Blocking pedestrian traffic, that was something that we heard Mr. Taibbi talk about last night. So these things weren't criminalized in the past, but they are today. We also see how contemporary techniques of policing and surveillance reinforces assumptions about mass incarceration. And then, of course, the naturalization of incarceration as the solution to social problems. So pertinent here is the fact that soaring rates of incarceration, these ones that I've been speaking of, they correspond with this period of time that we've seen the entrenchment and extension of colorblind racial ideology. According to colorblind racial thinking, this growth in incarceration and its racialized implications, it's not the effect of a racialized social system, but rather the unfortunate outcome of individual choices and higher rates of participation in crime by African Americans and Latinos. So in contrast to this line of thinking, many criminologists, many legal scholars, many social scientists and scholars of race like myself, argue that the criminal justice system operates as a racialized system of social control, and one that extends from and is deeply rooted in racial histories. We can think of other racial institutions that inform this, for example, slavery and Jim Crow. There is overwhelming evidence illustrating that racial inequalities at every step of the criminal justice system, that they really cannot be described or explained solely in terms of increases in crime. So we might think about this, for example, in relation to the surveillance and policing of particular neighborhoods. We might think about which individuals are stopped by police in the first place. Again, Mr. Taibbi's talk was useful in thinking about this. He talked about the stop and frisk program, which some of you might be familiar with in New York City. It overwhelmingly targeted young men of color, Black men and Latino men. We might also look at the cases that are prosecuted. So which cases receive deferred prosecution, which cases do not. And we can also see the sentences attached to various crimes and convictions as having a racial component. So, some of you might be familiar with this. Some of you may have heard of Michelle Alexander, a legal scholar. She's written a book called The New Jim Crow, which is really interesting. And, I encourage you to look at that if you're interested in these topics. But one of the things that she points out, and I think it's a really powerful statement, and it's worth noting right now, is that there are more Black men incarcerated today than there ever were enslaved. So that's a really powerful thing to think about when we consider the contemporary racial context. So rather than adopting an anti-racial perspective, so once again, one that ignores race or that develops an ahistorical understanding of racial relations, an anti-racist view of incarceration situates incarceration within this longer trajectory of racial exclusion and violence in the United States. Okay, so I now want to move into a brief discussion, unfortunately it has to be shorter than I'd like, of my research on women's post-incarceration experiences in Milwaukee. And in this section, once again, I want to foreground an intersectional approach. So one that interrogates the spatiality of imprisonment, so understanding these geographical patternings, but also that sees incarceration as not just racialized and classed, but also as gendered in really important ways. Okay. Though proportionally, men make up the vast majority of those who are incarcerated, the number of women in prison is growing really rapidly. In fact, the female population in prison has grown at a far faster rate than men. We see that the growth rate for women is almost 800%, so 757% over the past 3 decades, and that nearly doubles the male population growth of 388% during that same period. So this is a striking configuration. And the vast majority of women imprisoned, particularly during the period of the 1990s and the 2000s, which is really the growth period of time. So 1 in 4 women incarcerated during this period were sent to prison for nonviolent drug offenses. Once again, getting us back to the kind of thinking about the war on drugs and its implications. Many scholars have called the war on drugs a war on the poor, but feminist scholars also argue that it's been a war on women as well, driving the remarkable incarceration of women, particularly of women of color. The vast majority of women who have experienced incarceration have been in prison for crimes connected to their economic and social marginalization. So we often see crimes like fraud and forgery. Again, if we think back to Mr. Taibbi's talk last night, we can think about the gender dimensions that we see here. As of 2010, 1.25 million women were under some sort of correctional supervision. And these statistics make really abundantly clear that women, and particularly women of color, are being criminalized at historically unprecedented levels. So we've never seen this in our past in the United States, and we don't see these kinds of patterns emerging in other similarly industrialized nations. And despite this spectacular growth, we've heard very little about this. There's not been a lot of public outcry about the rapid expansion of women's incarceration. So in spite of commonly held conceptions of the prison as spatially and socially confining criminal populations on a semi-permanent or permanent basis, the prison is better understood as just one site within a larger circulation within the carceral system. So we think of incarceration as being really finite and static. And in fact, people who experience incarceration are often in a lot of movement. A lot of mobility and movement characterize incarceration. And in fact, the average stay in prison is typically quite short. And 95% of those who are incarcerated will eventually be released back into society. So given this incredible number of people that are circulating through the system, surprisingly few provisions are in place to support those or to aid those who are returning or home from prison. So going home is often means returning to low-income neighborhoods or impoverished neighborhoods, many of which are devoid of living wage jobs. If you're interested in more of this, geographers Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore have done a really interesting study on how this takes shape in Chicago, what it looks like. So these employment constraints, going back to neighborhoods with very few work opportunities, are further compounded by conditions that criminalize former prisoners. So a felony record often leads to a lifetime ban on a range of benefits. So we're talking about subsidized housing benefits, welfare, student financial assistance, and supplementary security income. And these sorts of benefits are often the kind that are most needed upon returning home, when individuals have very little resources to secure housing or to locate employment. So this context leaves really very little room for post-incarceration success. And many people suggest that this creates a revolving door of the prison, that we see that the revolving door of the prison has now become one of the critical ways in which we see the expansion and growth in incarceration. Okay, so now I just want to give a brief discussion about the Milwaukee context. Milwaukee has a very distinct racial and urban geography that informs my study. So the city's urban landscape has long been marked by racial segregation. A lot of people don't think about Milwaukee when they think of segregated cities, But in fact, recent analyses of 2010 census data identify the city as the most segregated in the nation. And other data from the 2010 census identify the city as the 4th most impoverished in the country. So, there's a distinct patterning here that's worth studying. Studies also place joblessness rates for African American men who are heavily concentrated in Milwaukee's very deindustrialized inner core at above 50%. So when I talk about that area, I'm really referring to this area. And I don't know, probably those of you in the way back can't read my legend here, but the areas that are really dark blue are 85.1% or more white. The areas that are dark red are 85.1% more black. And this kind of yellowish color, that's 85% more Latino or Hispanic. So you can see, it's quite striking. Again, I apologize for the small numbers here that those of you in the back can't see. Currently, over 35,000 people are in prison or in jail in the state of Wisconsin, with over 50,000 people on probation and 18,000 people on parole. Of those numbers, 1,189 are women. Again, a much smaller number, but that period of growth has been so striking that it really warrants more investigation. And the racial disparities that characterize the system in Wisconsin are quite striking. So for every white person incarcerated, 10.6 black people are incarcerated. And this is much, much higher than other Midwestern states, much higher than Illinois, than Ohio, and even Michigan. And in fact, Milwaukee has received quite a bit of notoriety lately. In 2013, a study garnered substantial international and national media when it found that Milwaukee has far and away the highest incarceration rate of black men. So that's what this table is showing. These are, all the other states. Here is Milwaukee, kind of leading the pack. A remarkably high number of people in the state's prison system are from the poorest neighborhoods of Milwaukee. And in fact, recent studies locate a disproportionate number of former prisoners and men and women on parole and living in just 2 zip codes in Milwaukee. So these 2 zip codes in Milwaukee really leading to the expansion of incarceration in the whole state. And that is this area right here. If you think back to the map I just showed you, that corresponds, with very African American neighborhoods. So this near north side area is located squarely in Milwaukee's black community, but it's one that has been devastated by deindustrialization. So that's actually what led to the buildup of the black community in these areas, were the factory jobs. These are areas that have experienced enormous pressure from the processes of redlining, from property clearance for highway construction. You see, this is a major highway, a thoroughfare that just kind of cuts through that neighborhood. And so reflecting this geohistorical context, the area continues to struggle with high rates of poverty, with joblessness, and fewer employment opportunities. Okay, so the state has also seen a dramatic increase in women's imprisonment. And so mirroring the trends I just showed you, African American women from Milwaukee's near northwest side make up a significant proportion of this population. So this is kind of the broader context of the study. And to understand more about women's reentry experiences and the services available to them, I've interviewed social service providers in organizations that are offering reentry services. And I've also interviewed a number of women who have experienced incarceration, so have been going through the process of reentry. And I should note that this project is ongoing, so I'm still in the process of interviewing individuals. For many of the women that I spoke with, their release dates were met with both fear, apprehension, elation. Freedom is exciting and terrifying after years of confinement and after what many of the women described to me as traumas that they experienced in prison. All of the women that I've interviewed experienced a sense of isolation, of invisibility, and of a feeling of abandonment following incarceration. They note that this sense of abandonment is compounded by the relative lack of reentry services, both from the state and from nonprofit agencies. And they also noted that there was a real lack of services that were geared specifically towards women. Indeed, most of the women that I spoke with had no contact with organized nonprofit services for assistance. And those that did, really didn't find the experience to be useful or helpful. So this is a quote that illustrates this. I'll read some of the quotes, but some of the quotes I'll just allow you to read on your own. So this is from an individual named Camilla. And when I asked Camilla more specifically about why the reentry organizations that she visited weren't helpful, she further explained that many of those that are working in nonprofits associated with reentry really are disconnected from the process. They don't know what it feels like to come out, she said. They to have to go home. They don't know what it feels like to not have food to eat, to struggle, and to live on the street. For the women in my study, the stigma and marginalization of having been incarcerated is compounded by their assumptions about femininity. So when I say this, what I mean is assumptions about what it means to be a woman. In particular, several argued that their experience with prison was seen as the ultimate transgression of womanhood, particularly for mothers. So a recent survey of women who are incarcerated in Wisconsin finds that over 80% are mothers. And this statistic makes very clear the devastating effects of incarceration on families and in communities. Again, if you think about the high concentration of incarceration in particular places, you can think about what this means for neighborhoods and communities themselves. But this also illustrates the fact that many women who are experiencing or negotiating reentry are often endeavoring to care for their children or to once again regain custody of their children, all the while contending with norms about crime and value and appropriate femininity. So these beliefs shaped the way that women were viewed in various arenas. As Michelle fiercely explained in this quote, society continues to punish women who do wrong because we can't comprehend how a woman who's supposed to be a nurturer and a caretaker and a caregiver and all those things could do something that would be harmful to other people. With men, it's like it's expected or it's understandable. But with women, we can't comprehend it. And so we're going to continue to punish them, whether or not it's consciously or otherwise. Michelle's astute analysis strongly resonates with feminist theories about women, crime, and incarceration. Feminist criminologists have also traced the ways in which historically women committing crime have been viewed as particularly morally depraved or engaging in activities that contradict their moral organization. And this is, in a different way, they're seen as being particularly egregious compared to their male counterparts. And of course, these assumptions are highly racialized. If we had more time, I could talk about the different ways in which white women or women of color have been positioned within the system of incarceration. So these kinds of gendered assumptions shape multiple ways that women experience reentry. And a clear theme that was emerging in my study is the complete lack of job skills or educational training to prepare women for reentry. So while few would argue that there are enough programs for anybody who's experiencing reentry, for men or for women, that we see this as being particularly pronounced for women. And because of their historically larger numbers and their proportional size, there are a lot more programs addressing men and men's reentry needs. However, assumptions about gender and employment clearly shape the kinds of programs that are available for women. So for example, recently developed programs at the women's prison in Wisconsin include a beauty salon and training for clerical work. And these are important services, but most of the women that I spoke to really didn't feel that these gave them any kind of adequate training or preparation for reentry. Now, by contrast, long-standing programs in the men's facilities train inmates in industrial trades, trades that, the stigma of prison notwithstanding, opens up the possibility of higher paid employment upon incarceration. So reflecting more on this, Michelle noted that society hasn't caught up to the reality that women do go to prison and that they do need training just as much as men. And she went on in her interview to explain that there were very few resources available for women in the prison and that there was a strong sense that on a whole, there was very little support to help her prepare for employment on the outside. Now, sadly and not surprisingly, given the preponderance of policies that criminalize those who have been incarcerated, every single one of the women that I've interviewed in this study has emphasized the hardship of finding employment when they return home from prison. So this is a really long quote, and I'm not sure if you in the back can read it, but in this quote, Gina is explaining the constant stigma of having to describe her felony record to employers, and her feelings that her punishment was a never ending, that she had served her time, but nonetheless she was still doing time on the outside because she couldn't find a job to adequately support herself or her family. Many of the women that I've spoken to in this study are seeking employment not only to support themselves, but also, once again, to support their children and also to support other family members. A woman named Marie, who I spoke with, talked a lot about how she believed she wouldn't have gotten her waitressing job had she not actually known the employer or known the manager and had him, quote, take a chance on her. We're getting close, but I just want to point out a few more details here before we're done. Beyond employment and housing, which are clearly critical and often required in the parole process, for many women, the most immediate needs when coming home from prison are even more basic. So finding shelter, being able to access food. And while many of the women that I spoke to were able to call upon friends or call upon family members to stay with during this very insecure period of time, some were not. Several of the women I spoke with were homeless for a period of time following incarceration. Camilla, who was homeless for a period of time, explained this fundamental need in this way. She said, you have to be able to find some place to rest, somewhere safe, not just anywhere, somewhere safe. And staying with family members can often heighten stress during this period. For women who are experiencing felony convictions, the need to return home, many of their home spaces are actually dangerous spaces. These might be environments where drugs are still being used or where there may be violence in the home. So this fact is compounded by those restrictions on housing subsidies available for women or for people with felony records. I'm going to skip past this. A social service provider that I spoke to referred to this as really just setting women up for failure. You know, this notion of barring individuals from employment opportunities, limiting their housing, requiring them to return home to highly stressful family dynamics. The possibility for success is very slim. And so when asked what women do under these circumstances, Camilla, who I've quoted several times, talked about an informal support group that she created. And she funds this out of her pocket. And it supports as a way to, serves as a way for women to exchange information about jobs, state things that they need. I need clothes to wear to a job interview. Can someone give me a ride to a job interview? Or I need to see my parole officer. And she talks about the way that this really filled in a critical gap for her and other women who really felt like their needs weren't being addressed by the larger nonprofit organizations in the community or by the services provided by the state. I'm going to just skip a few slides here because I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. But one of the key things that I want to conclude with here is noting the significance of examining gender-specific experience of incarceration. So thinking about the way that women are affected not just by male incarceration, but also the way that they themselves are becoming historically criminalized and swept up into the criminal justice system in really critical ways that have key impacts on communities and neighborhoods, and that are really, really shaping family relations and social reproduction in low-income neighborhoods of color. And I want to once again return to this notion of an anti-racist approach that adopts not an anti-racial view, but instead thinks about the way in which incarceration is situated within this longer trajectory of a racialized social system in the United States, and that also foregrounds not just the way that the system of incarceration is racialized and classed, but also the way it is very specifically gendered. And so I'll stop right here so that we can take some questions.
So much, and thank you so much for a very captivating talk. This is really striking, and it does raise quite a bit of questions. And before I get questions from the audience, I'm going to ask one, and that is this. What sort of employment opportunities might some of the women who have been released from prison pursue and be successful in gaining?
Yeah, a lot of the women that I spoke with worked within the service industry. Specifically, they were working at fast food restaurants. And in fact, some of the larger fast food companies have arrangements with the state where they specifically work with people that are on parole. So one of the quotes that I skipped through really quickly was from a woman named Gina. And her case was particularly heartbreaking. She was a clear example of someone who'd been kind of swept into prison by being at the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, she hadn't really done anything. She was just an accessory in a drug deal that had turned violent. And anyway, she was in prison for a really long time because there were multiple layers of additions that were added through those drug policies. And in any case, she was in her 50s, and she spoke with me, and she had been working in the fast food industry for 15 years. And she was frightened for her future. She was having health problems, and she was worried that, you know, she wasn't going to be able to, you know, support herself in later years on that income. So a lot of fast food employment, people working in hotels, waitressing, that kind of work.
So their best possible scenario to them may have been in the low-paying service sector.
Yep.
Questions in the audience?
I actually have one, and I.
Go ahead.
Oh. We were talking about this in class today, actually, about race and the how long it has taken to accomplish any kind of change, and how very slow it is happening, and yet how very quickly it happened for LGBTQA. And one of the things that a student brought up was the quote by Morgan Freeman recently. And I don't know if you all have heard about this one, where he said, the best way to address race is to stop talking about it. Stop referring to me as a black man. And he was angry that there is Black History Month because he's an American. And you know, we don't have White History Month. Should we have a Jewish History Month? So my question is, and some of my students had that as well, and I see several of them here, how do we move forward if part of the thinking is, again, to achieve that color blindness of not seeing any of it, yet clearly to not talk about it is to not recognize a really severe problem.
Right, right. I mean, I think that's the real challenge. I think, you know, our ultimate goal of a society is to be a colorblind society. But, you know, a lot of the scholars of race that study these dynamics would say that it's harmful to not talk about it. That if we can't talk about it, and if we can't address it, and if we can't identify that, in fact, you know, we are racialized groups of people because we as a society extend particular meanings onto particular racial groups. If we can't talk about it, then we really can't confront the problem or change it. And so, you know, there have actually been a number of celebrities who have come out and said things that have been, you know, interesting. Farrell said something, Raven Simone said something. And so, you know, this is something that's hotly debated in a range of communities, within the Black community, within communities of color. But, you know, scholars of race see it that the overall suppression or not talking about race as being one of the limiting factors. Because if we're not actually talking about it and acknowledging that, look, this, you know, we have issues we need to talk about, we need to deal with, then we really can't make our way forward.
Definitely something for us to ponder. Another question I have, by the way, relates to this matter of the nonviolent drug offenses being the predominant crime that many women have been incarcerated for. Is that largely marijuana, or are they other types of drugs? Do you know?
You know, I would have to look at the statistics to find out. But, you know, this holds true for men as well. We see that a lot of people that have been, you know, incarcerated for drug offenses are in prison for marijuana offense. Did you? Great.
Well, violent crime is down to the pre-1970s rate. Mm-hmm. And so with that 787% increase since that time, we're still talking about a huge increase when violent crime has gone down.
Right. I think that's the contradiction a lot of people don't know. Violent crime is decreasing, but then we've seen this incredible growth.
I used to live in Milwaukee for a very brief period of time, and so I was struck by, I didn't know that Milwaukee was the most racially segregated city, so I was kind of surprised by that. But I did, in the short time that I lived in Milwaukee, Milwaukee always struck me as a very ethnic city. And so I'm wondering, amongst the white population of Milwaukee, is it also the most ethnically segregated as far as Irish, Polish, in that sense? I'm just curious if there's if that's also true amongst ethnic whites.
It was for a period of time. For example, historically, Polish immigrants lived in the South Side. Actually, some of the, oops, wrong button here. The area where we see a high concentration of Latinos, those were actually South Side neighborhoods where we saw German populations. And incidentally, another fact about Milwaukee, you know, at one period of time, they had so many German immigrants in the city that it was the most German country other than Berlin. So there was city. Let me get the right geographic scale here. So it has a high number of German immigrants. But over time, there was a kind of a consolidation of ethnic white groups. And in fact, you know, Milwaukee has also been called the Selma of the North. I don't know if you've ever heard this, but there was really intense social activism and civil rights activism that took place, particularly over housing issues in the 1960s. You know, a lot of the ethnic white neighborhoods, Polish neighborhoods in particular, were a key part of the strife there as they were transitioning and changing. One of the bridges, it's right in this area, they used to call it the longest bridge in the world because it was a bridge that connected, you know, ethnic white America, and this is what they would say, a really derogatory racist term, it connected ethnic white America to Africa, because it was the bridge that connected the very, very black neighborhoods in Milwaukee that were made so by racially restrictive covenants to these ethnic white neighborhoods. So that's a long response, but it's really a fascinating city in terms of its immigrant and ethnic history.
Do you think that raising the minimum wage to like a living wage, would that make a difference for these people coming out?
I mean, I think there's no doubt if this is the kind of work that's available to people, and if we know that increasingly people are not just in, you know, fast food employment on a temporary basis, it's not just teenagers anymore, right? If people are depending on this kind of work to raise families and support households, then, you know, in my mind, raising the minimum wage would be a first step. But I think one of the things we have to ask ourselves as a society is if we know this is continuing to be a problem, you know, there are so many people who have experienced incarceration. You know, after people do their time, they've been punished for the crime that they've committed, should they be able to, you know, have access to the same kinds of jobs and resources that the rest of us would like to have? So it's really kind of a really large social question that we need to consider ourselves as a society. But that's a start.
Sorry, I don't have a mic. Do you see any change in the future for women? I mean, is there anything on the rise, like, for women that are coming out of incarceration? Is there any talked about discussions for helping people?
Right now, no, but I think that there are more people, and that's kind of a sad response, but I think increasingly people, I think for so long, we just haven't seen that women are being incarcerated, that in fact, instead we've tended to think about women's experiences as being impacted by men's incarceration. And certainly that's a part of it, with the number of men that we see incarcerated. But I think increasingly, if we can, you know, make visible the fact that women too are incarcerated, that women too are experiencing these trends, then, you know, kind of bringing more public awareness to it, then that's kind of the first step in beginning to address the problem. And I think also challenging our taken for granted understanding of incarceration, you know, the fact that this has happened in such a short amount of time, and yet we really, you know, kind of just accept it as the way things have been for a long time. I think thinking critically about incarceration is a first step, but I think we have a long way to go.
How do you best start a conversation about race and gender and with people who may not be exposed to the topic?
Oh, well, let's see. We know how not to do it via Starbucks, right? Did you all hear about the whole, you know, poor baristas, they're making minimum wage, and then now they're supposed to engage with customers about, you know, the most vexing and pressing problem in our society in the, you know, few seconds that they have. I think it's a really hard conversation, and part of the reason it's so hard is because of this colorblindness. Part of the reason it's hard is because it's painful, and because it brings up all sorts of feelings. It might bring up feelings of guilt or shame, or it might, bring up anger. And so I think, the best thing that we can do is just try to be honest about it, and to be open, and to state to other people that, we're doing the best we can to talk about it in an environment where, it's become an issue that we're not supposed to talk about. So I think just starting the conversation, opening it up, is a way to start building connections. I realize that's kind of a vague answer, but that would be my response. I don't think I have any concrete steps.
Good evening. I was wondering if you had any tips, because when people get out of prison, it's kind of hard on the family too.
Right.
Like for someone that's been, it's just kind of weird that we're having this conversation tonight, because I have a brother. I came from a small town. It was really racist. Like you go across the bridge, white people lived over there. You know you're not supposed to go over there, but the police will harass you and all that. But he got locked up. He just got released yesterday from doing 24 years and some change. Yeah. So what can we do as a family to help him? Right now he's in a halfway house, but trying to find a job or anything. Is it anything that we can do to help him? Because I don't want him to go back to prison. He could be so used to being there. He's been there most of his life.
Yeah. I mean, it's so painful for families, and it's so hard to heal those relationships too after such a long period of time. I mean, you think about 24 years. The things that have changed. Cell phones, everything, the whole way that we interact and communicate with one another is totally different. So this is, it's a profound change. And I think probably the most important thing that families can do is provide that, kind of unconditional love and support, and direct individuals to these services. A lot of times people that have been incarcerated don't know about the kinds of agencies that are out there or the services that might be available to them, because the state, sometimes doesn't do a lot to communicate, doesn't connect people to nonprofit agencies. And so I guess, you can be supportive and also be advocates, maybe connecting him to maybe local agencies that might provide training or that kind of a thing.
All right, first of all, in response to the Morgan Freeman and Raven Simone statements and people who think that we should just quit talking about race at all, it's kind of like the white way is the way, and if we don't have Black History Month, then we're not going to hear about Black History Month.
We might argue that all months are right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's a pretty easy way to put it.
Yeah.
Also, I'm also wondering what causes Black people or minorities in general to end up living in these such impoverished areas. Would you say that our prison system is one of the biggest contributors to why they're so isolated in these impoverished neighborhoods?
Well, actually, the prison system certainly exacerbates things. But we saw that that's a, fairly recent phenomena. And, in the classes that I teach in urban geography or in the geography of race, we talk about the production of a segregated urban landscape. And it's actually, it's a very long historical trajectory that creates these kinds of isolated patterns. It has to do with migration, where ethnic or racial groups move to cities in the first place. But what's really significant is when you think about the basis of growth in cities, and in Milwaukee's case, for example, much of the Black population moved to the area in the 1960s. It was a late area in terms of receiving immigrants or Black migrants from the Great Migration, and they concentrated in that corridor because it was near a lot of the factories that were hiring. But what's really critical is that there were a lot of the suburban or outlying areas, these areas in this there, this was a period of time when there were racially exclusive covenants, often dictated residential suburban housing patterns. So even if during this period of Black migration to the area, Black individuals wanted to live in other parts of the cities, there were often restrictions that were legal at the time that prevented them to moving into other places. So you have a whole host of structural forces at play that really produce segregated landscapes that stretch across a long period of time.
This is just going to make it a lot worse, right?
Right. It intensifies the pattern. Yep.
All right. This concludes our session. I'll ask you to please consider asking Ann Bonds. If you have any other questions, please come up after we give her a final round of applause. And thank you so much.
Thank you.